present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations. Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. On the first day of this week, we begin Architecture Week in Austin. Always the first week of this year, we're privileged to bring to you a very special emphasis on Austin Faith Dialogue pertaining to religious architecture. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we're privileged to have with us a couple of folks who are very gifted in terms of interpreting this architectural heritage of our city as it pertains to the religious community. We have Ben Heimseth, who has been a church designer in the city here and has particularly good perspective to bring us on the features outwardly that will give us something of the inward spirit. We also have Peter Maxim, who is an architectural historian and who will be bringing us some background pertaining to each of the structures that we're about to see both outside and in. As we come to this, gentlemen, I think we ought to take note of the fact that while Architecture Week begins that first Sunday, I believe the 6th of October this year, that on the 13th, the second Sunday, there will be a walking tour. And maybe, Ben, you could give us a little bit of a sense of where that will be.
Sure. Well, the walking tour will start at 2 o'clock sharp on the steps of First United Methodist, and that will be one of the churches that is included in the tour. The roughly will run about 2 hours, so we'll say from 2 to 4 on October the 13th, and we'll see 4 churches on the west side of the Capitol this year as a follow-up to last year's event, which was the east side.
I see. And Peter, I went on that tour last year, and I remember seeing you there walking with us. And what is the background that you'll be bringing to us today in terms of your expertise?
Well, I'm an architectural historian by training and profession, and rather than designing buildings, I try to put them in the context of church building, what people have been, the sorts of buildings people have been worshiping in, and how in a lot of ways the churches that we're looking at today are not modern plans or Victorian plans, but really part of a continuum of 1,000 years of church building.
All right. And am I remembering correctly that you were one time connected with the Texas Historical Commission?
Yes, I'd worked for 8 years for the Texas Historical Commission in their National Register programs.
And the office for that, I think ironically, is in a church building, is it not?
Yes, it is. There are several buildings in the complex, one of which is the 1882 Gethsemane Lutheran Church, which is an interesting example of a sympathetic adaptive use for an ecclesiastical building.
Okay, well, let's take a look at that. That's one of our first visuals for the day. And Ben, maybe you could give us a little bit of a sense of what we're seeing here.
Well, certainly the Gethsemane Lutheran, and we begin the tour, if you will, here with one of the oldest church structures existing in Austin. Is a great example of a traditional, what you might call a country Gothic church. And if you'll notice, it has what you would expect on a church of this age. It was, Peter will give us some details on its, on its age. But it's a nave form with a central tower, which marks the entrance, and a rise of steps up from the street will usher you into the Gothic-inspired structure.
Okay, and Peter, give us a little bit of background on how this was built.
The congregation was actually organized first in 1868. The founder of this particular church was a very interesting character by the name of Sir Svante Palm, who was the Swedish consul to Texas. And the congregation was formally organized in 1875. The church was built from the original brick of the 1850s Texas Capitol, 2 or 3 blocks away when it was burnt.
Oh, I see.
Bricks from the Capitol were used in the construction of this new church.
They were doing recycling even before they had the term to describe it.
Indeed, very
Okay.
handsome sort of Austin common brick.
And let's think too now as we look at a second shot on the interior, what feature that this might represent, Ben?
Well, now the apse of the church, or the traditional area of the sanctuary, oftentimes is in a group like this and recycling rich. It also is just being darn frugal, which is very important often with congregations. But you do put a lot of energy and emphasis at the sanctuary, and if you notice the wood carving of the altar area and the screen around, and also the ornate stained glass windows. They are up and down the nave itself, but I think a good example are the windows here behind the sanctuary.
Okay. And then there's a view that we have looking from the other angle toward the back of that sanctuary.
Now, oftentimes a traditional church will have a choir loft, as it's referred to. The stairs in Gethsemane are flanking on either side of the main aisle. It's a combination of gaining some extra space, but also having the, if you will, heavenly choir music from up above. And an interesting detail here, if you'll notice, the columns are what's called a chamfered column that are holding up the altar area. And the details on that are almost identical to what would have been on any mercantile building of the time.
Okay.
And if you notice, the round element there on the altar emphasizes the center aisle, which is very important in a traditional nave church. The tower and the apse all on the same aisle.
I think we have maybe one other view of this particular sanctuary from the inside.
Well, there's the aisle. It's
Yeah.
right in line, the pews flanking on either side. Again, the classic kind of American church that would have been built 100 years ago.
Okay. I think this is, of the various ones west of Congress, this is the only one from the 19th century in terms of current structure. It's a different world in, Peter. What can you tell from that building that sits, it's on Congress and
16th.
16th, yes. What can you, just by looking at that, infer about what the world was like in Austin at that time?
Well, an interesting thing is that there were a great many European immigrants coming into Texas at that time, and a lot of times, in this case, Austin had a very strong Swedish colony, and so they would have built the church not only to represent what would have been popular in the United States, but also carrying a lot of traditions with them. The Swedes at that time, if you look at the stained glass window, you see sort of a who's who of Austin from that day, the Bergstroms and other prominent families that...
Oh, they're in the stained glass windows there.
Yes, that were in the dedication
Local saints,
plaques.
huh?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Memorials need to be recognized, and that's a good way in traditions to put the name in the stained glass and work it into the design.
Okay, well, folks can drop by and take a look at that, since it's a public building, I presume, and during the week.
It is used as offices by the Texas Historical Commission, but people can come by and see it, and it's a fine building.
Okay, well, let's turn to something that's in this century, and I understand that we have in chronological sequence, the next to go would have been Central Christian Church.
And Central Christian, as a comparison, is also a nave church in a fairly traditional form, but that's about where the comparison stops. This group, in about a generation later, made the jump to working into refined architectural styles, and in the 20s there was a great deal of exuberance about everything, including architecture and religious design. So the kinds of detailing and the rich tradition of architecture from many, many sources it was drawn upon by the architect.
You know, as I look at that, I'm just wondering now, is that Mediterranean, or almost seems a little Moorish in terms of some of its features?
I think that's an overriding characteristic. A lot of it has to do with the detailing and the coloring. There's a rich use of tile and multiple colors, and we'll see that on the inside as well.
Okay, let's take a look at the inside here.
This apse form now has become much more formalized, and again, I think you see the hand of a practiced architect now, as opposed to what had been more itinerant or local builders. They were
in
very
the 19th century.
in the 19th century,
yes.
before. Now, in the 1920s, you found that the architect's exuberance was being very freewheeling, perhaps, with some of the details, and the shell dome on the inside has been flattened out a little bit. Each one of those relief elements is a screen and is richly carved detail of church ornament.
Okay, let's look in the interior from another angle.
Well, now, in some of the more formal traditional architecture, particularly the large cathedrals in Europe, the long spans were made by having columns on the inside holding up the main volume, and then, if you will, sheds or lean-to elements against the side, which form the sidewall. We'll see this in other examples as well. Now we're talking about a much larger size as well, so for functional as well as architecture reference, these columns on the inside are harking back to that tradition of larger, more formal church buildings from Europe.
And one other interior.
Needless to say, the Westworks, as they used to be called in the traditional European building, the entrance to the place of worship, has always been a great deal of interest. The fantastic stained glass window, which this from the inside, but if anybody's even passed the building at night, you're aware of that wonderful stained glass window on the outside, is the way that this group would really be talking about their religion and the excitement that the architect was able to give every detail of this building.
Would you like to add to that, Peter?
Well, it's an interesting, it shows the metamorphosis of the congregation. The congregation itself is one of the oldest in the city. It was founded in 1847 and formally organized around 1850. The church design that you see here reflects very much the eclectic architectural styles that were so popular in the 20s, the Spanish colonial revival and the Georgian revival, and this one would probably be considered Mediterranean revival. But very rich architectural detailing, fine faux marble finishes on what are actually, I believe, cast iron columns. There were among the best. At that point, there'd still been an open inflow of European craftsmen into the United States, and this was really the heyday of that period.
And it was a wealthier society. They could afford to do more than they could in the 1860s. And
Rich, even the trusses that hold up that roof have been richly ornamented, and in fact are very similar to the trusses at Battle Hall at the University of Texas.
Okay.
It's interesting to note that the architect, Robert Leon White, was a University of Texas architecture professor and was more or less their supervising architect for some time. And it is similar in feeling to some UT buildings, but probably, as Ben pointed out yesterday, probably a closer analogy would be Rice University in Houston. Very much that fine, well-executed architectural style.
In our walking tour last year, I was reminded of the fact that when we came to St. Elias, the Orthodox Church down the street from Central Christian, that the stones that were used to construct that church in the 1920s had come from Christian Central Christian, that as that new building was put up that we just saw at that time, then they recycled that material in another place. So it's another example of having more than one use.
Well, good church design oftentimes does have that frugal element to it.
Right. Okay, well, let's look just down the street a little bit closer to where Central Christian is, to First United Methodist, and see what we can learn just by that view.
Well, actually, First United Methodist, as its inspiration really took the Capitol in the background, and I think you can see the comparison rather literally, even with all the construction going on. Obviously, there's a dome at the center of the building, but also the use of now very specific architectural elements from history. In this case, we would refer to this as classical architecture. The proportions are determined by a set of rules that were discovered by the ancient Greeks. And some of the elements that you see, the columns, the pediment or the triangle there that the columns hold up, and even the way the base is organized, all would have come from the ancient Greek or Roman temple design. That's the inspiration for classical architecture.
Okay, and before we proceed too much further into this, historically, when was this congregation started, Peter, and where were they at the time this was built?
The congregation was founded in 1839. The building was built 1923 to 28, which makes it pretty much an exact contemporary of Central Christian Church. The architects, Sanguinet and Statz, were among the most important, not just in Texas. They were home-based in Fort Worth, but they'd had a practice that involved many places outside of Texas as well. It's also interesting to note that, from my observation, this is a beautiful example of a classical revival Beaux-Arts building, and the Georgian styles were favored by the Methodists and the Baptists, for instance, while the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics preferred Gothic revival.
I see. Now look at that, though. Isn't that what they call the Akron plan?
Yes, it is. The arrangement of the pews around the altar with the choir at the very, I suppose it would be the very front of the church, and so on, and then the altar in a central place with the members of the congregation seating.
All right.
This also has, we'd seen the small balcony at Gethsemane Lutheran Church, whereas this has a very wide U-shaped balcony, which I guess gives more people the chance to be closer to the altar.
All right.
I think it's interesting, even on the interior, the reference to the Capitol building, because though it is an Akron plan, the layout of the balcony above surrounding the chamber perhaps is not at all dissimilar to the House and Senate chambers in the Capitol
building. All right, let's
building.
take a look. I think we've got just a bit of an angle on that
Now
dome.
this plastered and ornamental detail, probably not the original colors here, but you can see the amount of energy and fine craftsmanship that go into a building like this. And that's right as at the spring line of the interior dome.
Okay, so it's clearly an echo of just what's across the way there at the state legislature. And to that extent, you can tell something about what the purpose or mission of that congregation is by its exterior form.
Well, I think the background in the Methodist congregations has always had a great emphasis in the ministry on outreach. And in the 1920s, I think a very literal way of saying to everybody that we're reaching out to the state of Texas, to the purpose of Austin, was to perhaps make the government officials warm and welcome.
Okay. Now, let's view now another place and structure that would give us a little bit of a different sense.
Well, here also, this is the Catholic Chancery Building, and we're talking about now a later generation because this was completed in the 50s. But also now a later generation is interpreting and harking back to the Capitol. This is to the north of the Capitol building. In fact, 1 block north of Gethsemane Lutheran, which we saw previously. The central element does refer to the central element of the Capitol building. And in fact, inside that is a rotunda. If you'll notice the 2 flanking wings on either side of that central element, though they're very reserved and very stripped down now, because that is in the 50s the kind of style that the architects were practicing. It's been commonly referred to as WPA architecture. It was rather interested in making buildings look very permanent and very formal. But in fact, it is a classic one wing, center element, other wing that's symmetrical, just as the overall Capitol building is.
Okay, let's take a look on the inside there.
That's inside the receiving area, right there in the, I wouldn't call it a complete dome, but it is an elliptical room as you walk inside. Notice that there's a richness of materials though in the 50s also there was the ornament and the detailing had fallen out of favor, and craftsmanship was expressed more in planes of color and material and how well they could be formed together, not so much in how the ornament or the detailing would be bringing out symbols of Christianity, for example.
And as we look one more time, I think there's this view of the chapel.
Now the chapel, and this is an interesting aside because they were so interested in setting the formal feeling on the outside, Rich, that you would not know on the inside that this chapel was off on one side. So the function is not symmetrical at all, because one of the wings opens into this wonderful, very prayerful space. It's a rather small chapel, but as the generation earlier at Central Christian had harked back to the Byzantine or the Eastern Orthodox details, so too does this, though in a much more refined and perhaps reserved, almost cool way in comparison.
Mm-hmm. There's marble, it looks like, an inlay.
That's right, and some of the patterns with the tile are very bright and contrasting, but not nearly with the kind of relief or almost exuberance as we've seen before. Now it's done in a very perhaps cool, I might even say cerebral kind of way.
All right. Peter, tell us a little bit about what you can in terms of how the diocese, you know, when it came here and how this building represents that development.
Well, it's interesting. Of the buildings that we are considering today, this is the only one that was not the successor to an earlier building. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Texas was created in the 1950s, and this was their first chancellery, that is to say the diocesan headquarters. The architect of this particular building was one Walter Koch of Waco. But again, I would concur with Ben's comments on it. It's a very classical form, but in a relatively modern vocabulary for the day. Mm-hmm. And it's also one of the few buildings left in that Capitol complex area between the Capitol and the university that remains in private hands.
And one of the things, too, that occurs to me is that prior to that, the diocese now of which Austin is part was part of one that, as I recall, was headquartered in Houston or Galveston or something of that sort.
I believe so. I'm afraid I don't know the full story.
And so that as the church grew and they had an area that was encompassed currently by the diocese boundaries, that became the headquarters for this region.
As the Central Texas Diocese was formed, that, as Peter said, in the 50s became its headquarters. It all essentially, as Peter pointed out, started from scratch, as opposed to some of the others that had been worshiping or organized in other facilities prior to their building.
Okay. We have a couple of other edifices to look at, both of which are more contemporary in style. Let's turn to the Christian Science Church here.
Well, I think as the decades of the 50s continue, and this would be a contemporary of the Chancery building that we saw previously, the emphasis on cerebral probably couldn't be better expressed than with the Christian Science exterior. Planes of brick and were juxtaposed against planes of stone in very strong contrasting color. The side wings are of light color, and then the center is a very dark green marble. Interestingly enough, though, the Christian Science emphasis on what you might almost call a cerebral approach is also the architecture is also expressing traditional forms. Notice that right in the center of the complex, the entry is defined by a tower element, a very different tower than we've seen at Gethsemane Lutheran, for example, which would have been several generations earlier.
And let's compare that now with St. Martin's, which is another contemporary structure.
And St. Martin's, which also, as you see, has a tower, but this now placed off of the center axis. And St. Martin's with a traditional barrel vault, now made out of concrete, and the traditional columns, which we'll see next, made out of industrial steel. So the group, now late 50s, this was dedicated in 1960, are using modern architecture to come up with ways of celebrating the tradition of Christian form in architecture.
And then inside the sanctuary, what can you tell us?
Well, here's now the sanctuary area, or the apse that we've seen previously. The same kind of ornament now. I believe some of the furnishings carried through from an older building, and yet they really do set up a nice contrast with the rest of the building, which is also large planes of material.
Kind of a interesting juxtaposition of traditional and modern styles and motifs. And Peter, give us a little bit of the background in terms of architects of these two buildings we've just seen.
The earlier building was by a Chicago architect.
The Christian Science structure.
Yes, excuse me. The Charles D. Faulkner of Chicago, who was a well-known architect in that day. I don't know exactly how it was that he came to Austin. I'm sure there's a very interesting story behind that.
And the St. Martin's Lutheran had an Austin architect, I understand.
Yes, that was Jessen and Associates had designed that building in 1960. It's interesting to note, too, that I gather that Lutheran congregations usually are not named after saints, but in this particular case, the congregation was organized in 1883, which was the 400th anniversary of Martin Luther's birth. So
we'd have to kind of wonder a bit about how Martin Luther would have felt about being called a saint, but
perhaps maybe there was an earlier saint to hearken back to by that name, but anyway, it's a fine building. This is not the first location of the church. Earlier it had been on Congress Avenue in the what is now the Capitol complex, but when that area was redeveloped in the 1960s, the congregation moved to its present location.
Right.
And
I think that we might just in less than a minute that we have you give us just a quick view of what's going to happen in Architecture Week. Ben?
Well, the Architecture Week traditionally starts with the AIA's Homes Tour. There are really chances to talk about and celebrate the wonderful tradition we have of architecture in Austin, and sometimes overlooked. And so that's why the walking tour will round out the several events, and perhaps hopefully some discussions and articles about architectural issues, and announcing the winners of the awards program that the AIA runs every year as well.
Well, we appreciate your giving us this look ahead, and particularly as we'd have a chance to make a walking tour of these churches west of Congress, and would like to thank you both for being here. Ben, from the standpoint of giving us a view of the design part, and Peter from the historical side, and from the side of the Austin Metropolitan Ministries with our emphasis on how form follows function in a faith dimension. We are glad that you've been able to share this time with us today. I'm Richard Thompson, thanking you for watching, and be with us again next week. Peace be with you. For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries